And
And we should make sure that we introduce ourselves more thoroughly than we usually do because of that.
yes, yes. Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Informed Dissent podcast, this special episode. We bring you dispatches from the gender culture war. We're recording for a second time this week because we've all listened to the New York Times six-part podcast, The Protocol, and we wanted to have a follow-up conversation with Jamie because she is featured in one of or a couple of those episodes, but mainly featured in one in episode 4. We wanted to get her response and to discuss more about this. I'm Ben Appel. I've been on this beat for, just writing about this since like maybe 2021. I've written some things for Newsweek, the new homophobia, and for Spiked and so on. And my book, Cis White Gay, The Making of a Gender Heretic, is publishing on November 4th. It's available for pre-order now. I'm here with Sarah Mittermeier, who's also writing a book on this topic. Sarah is a researcher and writer, formerly known as Eliza Mondegreen, still on Substack. We have Corey Cohn. Corey's been in this for a long time, writing. Let's see, when did your op-ed come out for WAPO, for Washington Post, Corey?
I wrote a Washington Post op-ed in 2022 that was titled What I Wish I Had Known When I Was 19 and I Had Sex Reassignment Surgery.
Gosh, that was only 3 years ago. Okay. Wow. Yeah. So Corey wrote that pivotal, very important piece and has been testifying and super vocal about his transsexual experience and his history with gender medicine. And then we have Jamie Reed, and Jamie Reed is now the co-executive director of LGBT Courage Coalition, and she was the whistleblower for the pediatric gender clinic at Washington University in St. Louis, which we'll probably refer to as WashU throughout this. So did I miss anything about those introductions? Anybody want to add? Sarah, Jamie, Corey? No? Cool. All right. So welcome everyone. Jamie,
Maybe we should mention we usually have another co-host, Lisa
Yes,
Davis.
great point.
Lisa Sellen Davis, a journalist.
Right.
She is also writing a book about gender because that's just what people do now.
Yep. And she's written other ones and yeah, she's typically here with us, but she's I think out of town right now. Jamie, tell us about can you talk to, well, I guess maybe we can go through what the fourth episode was about, kind of just give a brief summary. Does anybody want to do that? Or Jamie, do you want to do that yourself and how that went?
So episode 4 was primarily recorded the night before and then the day of a hearing in Missouri for the SAFE Act. So that was a legislative regulation put into effect in the state of Missouri. I believe it was SB 49. It was passed, and many people believe or credited or claimed that my whistleblow story was somehow part of this grand scheme so that Missouri's Republicans could pass this ban. I will readily admit I was much more naive at that time, and I had no idea that they were even in the middle of the legislative cycle and still considering this ban. I knew that they had considered bans the previous 2 years, but I didn't know where we were at in the legislative cycle. I didn't know that the piece would make such a real change to the passage of that bill. So the bill passes, and then fast forward, the ACLU challenged the bill, as they do in many states, after it was passed, and they asked for an injunction. So this was going to be a really quick 2-day trial to see if they could mount enough evidence to show this law should not be allowed to go into effect quickly until a full trial could be put together. And so the journalists, Azine Ghoreshi, had been working with me for a number of months, and this was also the eve of the New York Times story.
And so just backing up really quickly too, this is 2023.
Mhm.
I think the first ban I think was introduced in 2021. Is that right? Like the lone
Yes.
bans, Alabama, was it? And then
Arkansas, Alabama.
yeah, so then in 2022, few more come along. Then 2023, they call it this legislative onslaught. So it was so people do frame Jamie's story, which broke in February 2023 in the Free Press, her whistleblowing report. And so, it did have a very big impact. And people were citing this, and Jamie's 23-page affidavit that she had filed with Missouri's attorney general, compiling all this evidence of what she had noticed while working at this pediatric clinic since 2018 or 19?
I started there in 2018. The center opened in 2017.
Got it. So yeah, so there, this is all going on. So continue. Yeah.
So I had been working with Azine for quite a while. She had come to Missouri a few times. I mean, I felt a lot of rapport with her. We had spent a long time going through, I don't know, thousands of pages of documents that um, I had from the center. And I will say these were not medical charts. These were primarily emails between staff members, the clinic team. Um, I had no direct chart material that I produced or gave her or drew from. So we had been interacting for a long time, and that is when I first learned that this podcast might be in the works. And that was the first time that I also met Austin. And to be real transparent, um, people who know me well have said to me, Jamie, you've said really kind things about Azine all along. I'm so surprised that you've been saying that after listening to that episode.
Mhm.
And I will say this. The Azine that came to my home that night with Austin was a different Azine than the Azine that I had met all along when it was one-on-one with her. And the reason I attribute that change is that Austin is a liberal, true-hearted lefty. He had so much more uh, concern or was much more skeptical around my political um, uh, what party I was with, and it almost seemed like Azine was demonstrating to Austin, I'm still in the tribe. Look at
Yeah.
how I'm questioning Jamie. I don't, and I don't even know if it had anything internally with her cognizant, but I remember texting a close friend after she left, and I said, wow, that was a different Azine. She really she still has a tribal structure that she has to fall in when she's in front of those people.
Yeah, what are your
Yeah.
politics, Jamie? Are you left?
Um, at the in 2023, I was a lifelong liberal Democrat. People sometimes joke in the Free Press I wrote that I was to the left of Bernie Sanders, but I was kind of that so far left. I was in an anarchist collective in my undergrad years. I was one of those anti-globalization WHO kind of protesters. I was in Black Bloc. Um, I I was very, very, very far left. And now just feel really politically homeless in a lot of ways.
So do
Okay.
you think Austin
So,
saw you as a traitor?
Yes, they really they saw me as being a collaborator with Republicans, which was somehow the like evil was the Republicans.
Okay, and I want to clarify just to so that I understand. Did they say or do anything that indicated that, or that this is your feelings after working with them on this interview?
Oh, well, no, they did. I mean, in the course of my interactions with the New York Times, there were a number of times when it was raised who my attorneys were was a really big deal, so that I had attorneys who are Republicans that I worked with a Republican administration and an attorney general, which
Mhm.
I'm in Missouri, it's a red state. But then also, the New York Times went as far as pulling the records of my voter registrations to see what party I had registered with
Mhm.
in the past.
That's smart because that's what you're claiming, and they need to corroborate that.
It was really weird though, because apparently when I moved from St. Louis City to St. Louis County, both my former spouse and I were somehow registered in the Republican Party that we had no recollection of doing and didn't know that that had occurred, which was very bizarre.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay.
So, so
And
just to back,
oh,
sorry.
sorry. Let me just say real quick. When we're saying Austin, we're talking about Austin Mitchell, who's an audio producer for this podcast for New York Times, and then Azine Qureshi, who's the reporter there
Mhm.
on the gender beat. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, so I was gonna say something that wasn't as well covered in that episode all about you as I would have hoped is really the content of your affidavit. So Austin and Azine talk about Azine being able to, you know, corroborate much of like almost all of what you said. Um, but the content was really left out. So can you just kind of talk about the basis of your concerns when you were working in that clinic and why you decided to do what you did in blowing the whistle? Whoa. Sorry, I tried
There, Sancho.
to.
So the affidavit itself had 86 separate line items. Most of those were um, they pointed back to cases of real concern. There was the overarching concern that is very similar to Tavistock. So the way I would characterize the overarching concern is that number one, the patient cohort completely switched in its sex ratio.
Yeah.
So I started in 2018, I left about 2022. We saw the kids coming had primarily been natal boys. By the time I left, they were globally natal girls. So it went from a 70-30 split to almost an 80-20 split from boys to girls. The age of presentation completely radically changed. So it went from
Mhm.
prepubescent kids who were primarily just clearly gender nonconforming in their presentation, and it went to 16 to 17-year-old girls. So I actually tracked the ages of presentation, totally switched, and they were all 16 and 17-year-old girls. And the other thing that the New York Times, I do think, mentioned in the podcast is that these kids went from um, basic, general, well,
Mhm.
mental health to very severe. These were very ill, mentally ill kids. And they had a lot of very severe presentations. So one of my core issues was that if you have your cohort completely radically change in presentation, you really don't know that the initial evidence that you were using to treat still carries over to your new cohort. But
Mhm.
also, why the hell do you have an explosion in total change in your patient population? So that was just scientifically, I just kept asking the question of why the hell did this all just change?
Just to help
Mhm.
clarify, what were you treating?
Oh, Corey.
What?
Um,
It's a medical clinic. What were you treating?
the clinicians did not agree and couldn't tell you. So I started
What do
in
you mean?
so I
We don't.
started in 2018. I was told we were treating a condition called gender dysphoria.
What's that?
It was a mental health condition where the body does not align with what the person believes their gender to be, and that they have significant distress over this misalignment, and that we would use medical interventions to attempt to change the body to align that gender.
Mm-hmm. And what's that caused by?
We we didn't discuss that.
Okay, is it a physical thing or a psychological thing?
It was a psychological problem being solved by a physical change was what we thought we were doing.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you.
But the two co-directors didn't agree.
Well, what were their viewpoints?
So very early on, I was part of what was the leadership team. So it was myself, the clinical nurse coordinator, and the two co-directors. We were leadership because the nurse and I were the only two positions in the whole center that saw all of the patients. So I saw every patient from the very beginning all the way through, and I saw their whole case from the whole big wide-eyed bird perspective, and so did the clinical nurse coordinator, which was why we were part of leadership team.
All the way through, is that them exiting as adults, or is that through the process of medicalization?
All the way through to them exiting the center as adults, or what I came to find out being lost because we were losing about 30% of those we were bringing in.
Okay, thank you.
So I saw the two co-directors have this very heated debate where the adolescent medicine doctor thought we were treating a mental health condition called gender dysphoria. The endocrinologist did not care if you met criteria for gender dysphoria. If you claimed a trans identity and if the drugs that he had available to give you matched what you wanted, then he did not care if you met criteria, if you were in distress, if your internal aligned soul could be switched to the new internal aligned soul presentation by the drugs he had to offer. He was perfectly happy to treat children. I saw them argue, and I saw the adolescent medicine doctor say to the endocrinologist, then this is just cosmetic. Mm-hmm. All this is a cosmetic intervention that we are giving to children that is permanent and irreversible, and there's no evidence to do that. And they argued back and forth for a significant period of time. It got heated, and that, I think, is what the podcast is trying to represent. I saw the Laura Edwards Leeper and the Joe Olson Kennedy arguing directly and within one center. I saw their argument right then and there.
And what we're talking about here is, if you've listened to the whole podcast, they give a really comprehensive view, interviewing both Laura Edwards Leeper and Johanna Olson Kennedy, and how different their approaches were. Laura Edwards Leeper was the founding psychologist at the first pediatric gender clinic in the US in 2007 at Boston Children's Hospital. It's called GEMS. And she adapted the Dutch protocol, which obviously from Amsterdam, went over there just for a week. I didn't realize this, but she was only there for a week, with Anna Lou DeVries and with Peggy Cohen-Ketnes, and she was sitting in on case studies with them and looking what they were doing, because clinicians around the world had started to learn about this protocol, which was, blocking kids' puberty to help them more convincingly passes the opposite sex as adults, because if they go through puberty, they're going to develop, especially the males, if they go through puberty, they're going to develop these secondary sex characteristics that are very difficult, that cannot be reversed, or that are very difficult to mask with a lot of surgical interventions and so on. So they were saying, let's freeze them and then give them the quote unquote correct puberty by kind of like mimicking a opposite sex puberty after blocking that puberty by giving them cross-sex hormones, which would be, estrogen for males, testosterone for females, and then continuing to block the unwanted the unwanted hormone, especially in males, blocking that testosterone because it's a really strong, interference there. And so Laura comes back and adapts this Dutch protocol for the U.S., but they're totally overwhelmed. So what the difference was in Amsterdam, they had like 10 mental health therapists and there was an endo. They were doing like a year-long assessment of these kids. They were super scrupulous and super picky and choosy about who they were allowing to proceed. They insisted that these kids have lifelong gender dysphoria, that their gender dysphoria worsens at puberty, that they have the support of their families, that they do not have serious comorbidities, other mental health issues. So Laura comes to the US completely over. She's the only one. She's the only mental health therapist, and she's doing this all on her own. So they start getting a few kids in. She has about 4 hours a week to do these assessments. So she's giving one assessment before they're being approved for medical intervention. So she becomes overwhelmed. So then they say, well, let's change it so that she soon says, this isn't the same. This is different. We're doing this differently. I'm really concerned. Let's have it so that the clients must have an established relationship with an outside therapist for 8 months before they come. She wanted them to be able to continue to get therapy throughout the process and afterwards, but also to have had that prior to her coming to them coming to her for these interventions in their hospital. So then slowly, like LA Children's, they open a pediatric gender clinic, and the medical director of that is Johanna Olsen Kennedy. A completely different approach. Johanna is like, no gatekeeping. These kids know who they are. We let them lead. And Laura Edwards Leeper talks about being at a conference and realizing how much this changed when she's on stage and she was invited to talk about on a panel about this process. And she's talking about how cautious they are and so on and so forth. And one other person on the stage, a doctor, said, that don't you think that's gatekeeping? That's re-traumatizing trans kids to have to make them explain their trans identity over and over and over again and prove that they're trans. If they say they're trans, they know they're trans, they should be. And Laura remembers that individual getting like a standing ovation for the things that she had said. And I believe Johanna Olsen Kennedy was also at that conference. So anyway, that's Johanna's perspective, and that's where it really divided. So Dutch protocol, no; gender affirming care in, where it's just, this idea of informed consent. We tell these kids what to expect and their parents what to expect, but regardless, we affirm their trans identity, and essentially they will be continued on this medical pathway.
Yeah, and this might also be a good opportunity to just say a few things about the Dutch protocol that I think were neglected in the podcast. So both about, I think the podcast certainly leaves the impression.
Hope you're breaking up, Sarah.
I think intends to leave the impression that the Dutch.
Hey, Sarah, can you repeat that? Because you were breaking up.
Oh, I'm breaking up. Okay.
You were, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So the podcast creates the impression, I believe intends to create the impression, that the Dutch have a way of doing this that's very responsible, that has good outcomes. Then there were Americans who tried to bring it to the US. They had to adapt the protocol for various reasons, but they tried to stay as faithful as they could to this, very successful, effective Dutch approach. And then there were these, renegades who were taking a much more Wild West approach to, follow the children. I don't counsel diabetics before I put them on insulin, which is something that Joanna Olsen Kennedy has said about why she doesn't believe in therapy before putting young people on a pathway for gender dysphoria. I think the podcast neglected some very important issues with the Dutch protocol as it was originally conceived and implemented. A lot of these are discussed in a paper that we'll link called The Myth of Reliable Research. We will also share Michael Bigg's paper about the original Dutch protocol and some of the issues. In the podcast, Annalie DeVries suggests that they screened young people for, they didn't want to be sending young people down this puberty blocking and hormonal pathway and surgical pathway if the reason that the young person felt like they were the other gender was that they couldn't accept that they were same-sex attracted. However, among this original cohort of patients, I believe all but one were homosexual or bisexual. So there is a big question about, what were the Dutch actually treating? And what are the quote unquote responsible providers in the United States who are medicalizing children actually treating? And I think all of us think that that is homosexuality in most cases for these more responsible providers who can look at teenage girls, with a late onset of gender dysphoria, with a lot of comorbidities and say, wow, that's not appropriate, that's a fad. But who look at a very feminine little boy or a very masculine little girl and think that that's an appropriate candidate. Something the podcast never does is really define gender or gender dysphoria. There are a lot of holes, and they also present the Dutch research and outcomes as being much stronger. So they talk about the original cohort of these, 70 Dutch teenagers, that they had a reduction in their gender dysphoria. This was actually accomplished because it was kind of a product of the way that they were measuring gender dysphoria. So the Dutch researchers were using the Utrecht gender dysphoria scales. These scales are sex specific. There's one for females and there's one for males. I pulled them up. So the one for boys asks things like, I prefer to, let's see. Yeah, this is the one for.
What are these scales measuring?
Sorry, do you want
to? Can you repeat what are these scales?
These scales
measuring?
purport to measure gender dysphoria.
Right, we can't define it. So
these scales say that they measure gender. No, they're not defining it in the scale, but I just want to give a sense of some of these questions. But I think that'll help people understand what was being measured, which is, so boys would be asked things like, every time someone treats me like a boy, I feel hurt. I dislike urinating in a standing position. I'm dissatisfied with my beard growth because it makes me look like a boy. Or I dislike having erections. And the girls' scales ask things like, every time someone treats me like a girl, I feel hurt. I hate menstruating because it makes me feel like a girl. I hate having breasts. I feel unhappy because I have to behave like a girl. So when the patients first entered the study, the females got the female scale. They were asked, how do you feel about your periods? How do you feel about your breasts? Things like that. Boys were asked, how do you feel about erections? How do you feel about beard growth? Then the scales, as the young people start transition, the scales are switched. So you are asking natal females, okay, are you happy to be, when somebody treats me like a boy, I feel hurt? And they say, no, of course not. Like, they would love to be treated like a boy. So their gender dysphoria has been addressed. They're also asked if they dislike having erections. They're asked questions that are completely irrelevant. So there are major issues around, some of the outcomes. And there are also concerns about patients that have gone through this process at the Amsterdam clinic. Something that I mentioned in our last podcast. Just want to address this really quickly. There was research presented at the European Professional Association for Transgender Health Conference in 2023. It was a study of patients from the Amsterdam clinic. I believe it was a 17-year follow-up. So the young people in the study were in their 30s at the time that they were followed up. My understanding at the time was that these 30 young people that they followed up were drawn from the original Dutch protocol, but it's possible that I misunderstood and that they were drawn from some other sample, some other long-term follow-up sample from the Amsterdam clinic. In any case, it's a sample of 30 patients. They were described as trans autistic patients. And they were followed over a long period of time. They were followed up to ask about how they identify now. And of the 30, 13 of them were not involved in the follow-up. It's a really high loss to follow-up rate. 4 declined. 2, the presenter said, passed away. And then the others, we don't know. So that means that out of 30, there were 11 question marks. 2 were dead. They followed up with 17, 2 of whom had detransitioned, and 1 of whom had serious regret after vaginoplasty, but still identified as trans. About the 2 suicides, later in the presentation, the presenter clarified that the 2 who had passed away had died as a result of suicide, and there was no information shared about when that had happened, but they were young adults because they must have been young adults because the patients in the study, they were in their 30s. I think early 30s. And the presenter said that there was just no crystal ball for how transition would go. I don't believe this research has ever been published. I think they have a responsibility to publish it. And hopefully people will ask the clinic about that. And I wish that the podcast should ask the clinic more about that. So sorry, long sidebar, but just while we were on the subject of the Dutch.
Can we try to drill down a little bit? How long? So you're saying that this would have been 30, they were 30 at the time. So this was
They were in their 30s.
so maybe 15 years post clinical?
I think it was 17-year follow-up.
Okay. Okay. Has there ever been a comparative to the 17-year and then to me, it seems like it's progressively getting, the outcomes are progressively getting worse as time goes on. And then just one other question. It doesn't sound like that study nor any really of the Dutch follow-up looked at their general medical health. So cholesterol, blood pressure, weight, urinary
I don't think so.
incontinence, anything like that.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. That was also a big oversight in the podcast, was just not talking about medical complications generally. And even when like FG brought up having an emergency because FG couldn't pee, that wasn't even followed up. Like that seems like a really serious, I think, life-threatening complication. Corey.
Well, I believe FG had a metoidioplasty with
yes.
testicular implants, and then later regretted or wanted a real phalloplasty.
Yeah, and they also, I realized these things would have been very delicate to ask about in an interview, but I mean, there had been an earlier follow-up study of FG where FG still had a lot of like shame about their genitals.
Yeah.
And like difficulty with relationships. And so this one case study, it's not really as rosy as it was presented. And then the subsequent, like the young people who were part of the original cohort, and then there was a follow-up study, like a retrospective study that the Dutch clinic did of 1,766 children and adolescents who had been seen in the first 20 years of the Dutch protocol. It would be good to present a much fuller picture for the Dutch to collect data that we don't have any reason to think that they've collected, but certainly which they haven't shared with the world about how those kids are doing.
Okay, so
and about really, yeah.
So I have a question about point of flow here. So
yes.
I think we could go into 2, maybe 3 different pathways right now. We could go down the pathway where we give this mom who screamed at me time, and we can explain what bicalutamide is and a little bit from the affidavit.
Yeah.
We also could then go down the pathway of the center where I was at already had the conflict of the Laura Edwards Leeper, Joanna, right there. It's an inception. And then the conflict's there. We see this flow through. And then how is it that I end up at the end of this diverging even from Laura Edwards Leeper?
Well, let's start at the beginning and go through all that. So that's good. Okay. So, and we can do that. So I will say in episode 4, they do, which I appreciated, was it says Azine started talking to people at the clinic to corroborate your affidavit. Mm-hmm. She reviewed all Jamie's documents, verified many of Jamie's claims. The clinic was overwhelmed with patients. There were about 4 or 5 new calls a day. She was confirmed that the kids had complex psychiatric issues and didn't always do psych assessments before medical treatments. That's confirmed. Azine saw a text from the co-director saying after the new SOC 8 standards of care came out that Laura Edwards Leeper had co-authored, advising caution. He said he was worried that the clinic didn't have the ability to meet these standards of care that were developed by Laura and Annalou de Vries, who is one of the Dutch clinicians. Azine confirmed that Jamie was being truthful, that patients were being harmed. Azine also found cases independently of people who had been harmed, including a detransitioner who got testosterone after a single appointment without speaking to a psychologist, even though she had already been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Azine sent this finding to Wash U. Wash U said they reviewed the notes of Azine and also I think the affidavit, Jamie's affidavit, and said their staff just responded with a kind of rote response, said their staff had treated patients according to the existing standards of care. So didn't admit anything, just said they treated them properly. Um, New York Times said most parents Azine talked to disagreed with Jamie about their experience at the clinic. And they said that Jamie misrepresented one case. And Azine had viewed this parent's text messages that showed that Jamie had misrepresented this case in her affidavit. And so then Azine and Austin go and visit Jamie and talk to her about this. And Jamie has a confrontation with this mother whose daughter's case she alleged, or son, I guess, male. I'm not sure if it was a male. Male.
I
Go
just
ahead.
printed the affidavit. Let
Got
me go get the line item.
So Jamie, when Jamie testifies at this hearing after the Missouri ban is passed in the legislature, the ACLU challenges it. So the hearing is about, are we going to let this ban stand while this is going through the courts, or are we going to allow these treatments to continue while this is going through the courts? They ended up saying, no, we have to stop these treatments while this is going through the courts. But that was the hearing that Jamie testified for 2.5 hours during. It was not recorded. They couldn't bring recording equipment. And after that, when Jamie was outside talking to Azine, talking to Austin, and Azine walked out with the mother who had gotten up angrily during Jamie's testimony. And there's a confrontation that's recorded there. But it doesn't seem like, according to what Jamie was saying, it didn't capture the whole thing, but it really would help to learn about what you may have gotten wrong and where that information came from and so on.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to read directly from the affidavit. I'm going to read line items 74, 75, and 76.
Okay.
74 is that one doctor at the center, Dr. Chris Lewis, a pediatric endocrinologist, is giving patients a drug called bicalutamide. It is spelled Bicalutamide. This drug has legitimate use for treating pancreatic cancer and other testicular cancers, but it has a side effect of causing breasts to grow, and it can poison the liver. There are no clinical studies for using this drug for gender transitions, and there are no established standards of care for using this drug. So then 75. Because of these risks and the lack of scientific studies, other centers that do gender transitions will not use bicalutamide. The adult center affiliated with Washington University will not use this medication for this reason, but the center treating children does. Okay, I really hope people read the whole rest of the affidavit because it's all come down to 76. 76. I know of, didn't say I know, didn't say I treated, didn't say I saw the chart. I know of at least one patient at the center who was advised by the renal department to stop taking bicalutamide because the child was experiencing liver damage.
Oh.
The child's parent reported this to the center through the patient's online self-reporting medical chart, my chart. The parent said they were not the type to sue, but, quote, this could be a huge PR problem for you. What I got wrong. Number one, the parent has stated that she said, this has been a huge PR problem for me. The reason why, okay, Corey,
Why would a parent have a PR problem? That doesn't make
Yeah.
sense.
And why would a nurse being told from a parent the words PR problem interpret that it would be about a family? The reason, the mom's family did not agree with her medicalizing her child.
Okay, can I ask a question really quick here?
Yeah.
So you got the quote wrong, or you're saying that you got the quote wrong.
Yes.
In the New York Times in the protocol, it's presented that you got that quote second. It was hearsay.
It was hearsay.
It was hearsay.
Correct.
So just to be clear, one, it's hearsay because you heard this from the nurse.
Correct.
Two, the quote was wrong. So there's two aspects here. So one is that it's still hearsay.
Which is why I wrote I know of, but yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so do you have any way of demonstrating that quote even existed?
Yes. So, and this was presented to the New York Times. So, and this gets super kind of in the weeds, but the nurse, I showed the New York Times the text messages where she said about this quote after the Free Press story came out. Wait, did you actually look in that kid's chart? And I said, no. And she said, oh, this is going to get tied back to me then. And she was very worried that she was going to lose her job over it. And I mean, I don't mind sharing this, these text messages, these screenshots. The Free Press story comes out. I share it with her February 9th, 2023 at 6:59 a.m. Her response, yeah, I'm definitely being fired. My response, why? No, she was not fired. My response, why? Her response, the patient that I asked if I should submit an event report about, that happened after you left. Did you comb through charts? Question mark. I never told you who that was. My response, no charts. Hers, well, then the only way you could have had that info was from me. My response, bicalutamide? Question mark. Her response, yes. My response, the editors and their lawyers allowed that story to pass only because there is a chart documentation as proof if it's needed in the investigation. I wanted bicalutamide in the story, and they thought it was important because it is not in the standard of care. I don't think anyone else will really put together the time frame. Do you? Her, yes, they absolutely will, especially since you referenced something a parent said in a My Chart message. The nurse never says this didn't occur. She never says you got it wrong. She never says anything like that. She simply is saying this occurred after you left, and the only way that it would have lined up with the timeline is because I gave you the information. Well, I also proved to the New York Times that the nurse also reviewed the entirety of the affidavit before it was submitted. She came very close to also becoming a legal whistleblower. This was, yes, I put my name and signed this affidavit, but I also had worked with that nurse for years and had no reason to not trust her reporting. And also, I will still stand by the renal department did tell the child to stop taking bicalutamide, that there was some kind of liver damage. The New York Times reports that the child was also given a COVID drug at the same time, which, okay, so if we think that the COVID drug, in addition with this untested experimental drug called bicalutamide, harmed the child's liver, what you're missing about medical ethics is that if this child was in an established, institutionally reviewed ethical protocol, they would have been told from the beginning, you should not take any other drugs that have a liver profile issue because this drug harms livers. So my point in putting this in the affidavit had nothing to do with this mom suing. It's a single sentence that had honestly, who the hell cares? The point of this story was this is a child who is being given an experimental treatment that would not even be used on adults at WashU. And they had the outcome that we were waiting for and expecting, which was liver damage. And the thing that the New York Times cuts, so the mom is yelling at me, which is fine. This was the other thing. I think I even said in that audio, if this is helping you, I will stand here and let you yell at me.
Yeah.
If this is giving her any closure, she can yell at me and scream at me. Let me be the bad guy.
I was amused at that, Jamie, because what you did is like the next level version of saying, "You need to calm down, miss."
But but
But I think she really meant it.
I really meant it. If
Well,
it
I know
was
you
her
did,
sincere,
but
it was going to help her processing this in any sincere way, yell at me. Because honestly, I deserved it. Because I worked in the center and hurt these kids. And I let this kid go on an experimental drug that had no protocol at all to be used in pediatrics, period.
well, what I'm hearing right now is you reframing this, saying, "I need you to yell at me because I deserve it." That's all. That's almost word for word what you just said right now. I'm twisting it a tiny bit, but not much.
I don't, I don't, I don't need to be yelled at, but I will accept it.
You feel I don't want to take us too far down here, but I do want to just make this point. What I see in you is somebody this is when somebody causes harm and they've done it on a pretty large scale, or they've been involved in causing harm. The You are trying to repair the harm.
Yes.
This is what your life is now, is you are trying to repair the harm.
And so the audio that they cut was that the mom probably continued to yell at me for a few more minutes. And then she made a critical statement, a statement that I think goes to the heart of all of this. She calls bicalutamide a blocker. And I said, no, no. You did not put your child on a blocker. You put your child on a feminizing experimental hormone. And it demonstrates the fact that she is screaming at me, yet doesn't even know what the hell she consented to for her kid, shows that we lied to her. It wasn't that we lied to her. And then she said, and I explained it to her, I said, no, 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 you don't understand how this drug works then. If you're calling this drug a blocker, it's not a blocker. And I tried to explain to her how it works. And then she says, it doesn't matter that I didn't understand because my child did.
Hmm.
So
And I said, that's not how consent works. That is not how.
This might be a rhetorical question, but I feel like I have to raise it again. What was that drug meant to be treating?
It was invented for prostate cancers.
Yeah, but in this case, why was it for it being prescribed? What was it treating for that patient?
It was treating gender dysphoria, I guess.
But we said earlier, gender dysphoria is up here. So we're prescribing a drug that causes liver damage and some feminizing side effects to repair something that is a psychological problem.
Yes.
In kids.
Yes.
And then the parents say, I don't care how it works as long as my kid thinks they need it.
Yes.
My kid understands, right?
This cannot be understood as medicine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't know what it's
So
treating.
tricky.
As you said, the co-leaders of this clinic didn't know what they were treating. They didn't know why they were treating it. That what you have is a flow of people who are making demands for certain types of pharmaceuticals or surgeries, and then a group of people who are providing those, who are filling the demand. That's it, right?
Yeah.
So it's become like consumer driven is You say something about consumerism and consumer
It's
driven.
consumer driven. It's consumer driven, but the patients and the parents largely don't understand that
Right. Also,
because we call
Jamie,
it medicine.
in the podcast, when they're talking about
Um,
what you have gotten, wrong or whatever about this and or misrepresented here, they say it turns out that the case was more complicated than, so if this patient did have some kind of liver damage that was likely from this drug because that's can be a consequence of taking this
No, it's
drug.
its known drug profile.
Okay,
Like
so
we
it's no drug
literally
profile.
just waiting for this to occur.
Got it. So then, but apparently, how I interpreted them saying, but this turned out to be more complicated, is that the liver damage was the result of some other kind of health issue.
The parent provided records that showed that the child was also treated for COVID around the same time or
Oh, I
was
see.
a COVID drug. Um, again, with medical research, if it was being conducted properly, they would have not put the child on the. I mean, that's how it. To
yeah,
me, the crux of the issue is why is this child on this drug, period. And I always viewed my affidavit as, hey, these are a whole bunch of breadcrumbs. I want somebody to go into these charts and figure it out. I wasn't saying that I had all
yeah,
of the answers. I was just saying there's so many harmful outcomes here. We need to figure out why this is happening.
Hmm.
yeah. Um, just with the time that we have left, Jamie, I think it would be really helpful if you could, and these interviews that were on the podcast took place about 2 years ago, and you said, a lot has changed, including your your perspective, and I think we want to give you a chance to say how and why that changed.
And I guess, oh, and how what she was saying about how it diverged from Laura Edwards Leeper as well, because it sounds like, this approach talking about, oh, we should go back to caution, or there should be caution, or there should be research, and then Jamie but I mean, from early on, Jamie was in support of these bans. There needed to be a moratorium on the service, but Jamie, you had mentioned that in the beginning you were more closely aligned with people like Dr. Lara Edwards Leeper and Dr. Erica Anderson, who had co-written the 2021 November 2021 op-ed in Washington Post about how the industry is failing trans kids. They said, and they were talking about how kids were being given sloppy care and raised the alarm on the lack of assessments and so on and psychological assessments, et cetera, and everything that was being considered. So you diverged from them, but at the beginning you were more closely aligned.
I
Talk about
would say,
that.
okay, so I actually drew a little diagram here of kind of the timeline of the Gender Center and, Laura Edwards Leeper and Joanna. So the center officially opened in 2017, but there were records of kids being medically transitioned all the way back to like 2015. So when I'm in these charts,
Yeah,
I'm seeing these kids, I'm seeing them in 2020, but they might have been put on a pubertal medical pathway back in 2015. And
yeah,
so what I feel like in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, I'm totally in the Laura Edward Leeper camp. That there is a guideline, if we just follow it, a whole bunch of these kids need to be told no, but there's this small subset of kids who would benefit. What I started to see by 2022 is I was seeing some of these kids who had been puberty blocked 2015, 2016, 2017 put on a hormonal pathway. These are supposed to be the success kids, right?
yeah,
These are the kids who physically passed. And I'm talking primarily when I'm judging this on a long-term scale, I'm the girls can, if you put a girl on testosterone, they're going to pass. If I put them on testosterone at 19 or 20, they're for the most part they're for the most part going at a quick glance going to pass. Okay, we could debate this. My concern around 2021, 2022 is I start seeing the boys who are blocked, who are feminized, and they look it. They look the part, but they're stuck. And as the caseworker, I'm called into a number of these cases, and they're stuck in such a way that my primary attribution to what I'm saying is stuck is the protocol itself. So they seemed frozen in time. They seemed frozen in their adolescence. They seemed like their functional progression had slowed or was erased. And some of them were doing really, really poorly. They were still going into sex work pathways. They were still depressed, anxious. I worked with one-on-one with them, with so many of them, and we were trying to just get them to get their GED. They weren't graduating from high school. They weren't getting a first job. And for many of these trans girls, they weren't leaving the house.
Mm-hmm.
And so where I thought Laura Edwards is kind of right, like, oh, if you just assess and you pick the right ones, then the outcome is going to be good. I just saw longitudinally, I just couldn't see the efficaciousness of it even in that period of time. And the thing that they were stuck about goes back to Corey. They were imposters. They couldn't internally muster that moving forward. And I think that what's so tough is that so many of these kids, even the like, what I think is this huge difference between what you see inside of a clinic in the charts in the background versus what, people publicly present is the ones that are being honest in that clinic space, they know that they're not doing well either.
Yeah.
So I just thought that this idea that you could just assess and pick the right ones, even the perfect candidates, the perfect ones, what we had asked of them to give up from their bodies was not being shown efficaciously like treatment down the long run.
Well, if I can jump in here too, when they interview Marcy Bowers, who is the former president of WPATH, a trans surgeon, operated on Jazz Jennings and obviously others, very prominent surgeon. When Zine is talking to Marcy and bringing up about how, you know, because Marcy's very intent on talking about clinical experience and anecdotal evidence, like this kind of, and even
Mhm.
Azim brought that up with Hillary Cass, and Hillary Cass said, okay, because Azim's saying there's so many people that are saying that they're seeing so many kids doing well, and so Hillary's saying, well, and I've also heard people with clinical experience. I've talked to those people that are saying they're doing well. And then I've talked to people who are saying that kids are doing very poorly. That's the failure, that's the weakness of anecdotal evidence. You need longitudinal studies. You need studies because all types of people can tell you different things. You can get one clinic where kids might be doing okay or saying they're doing okay, or the parents are like, wow, there can be all these different things. And I think Hillary Cass brings this up, but Azine brings this up to Marcy. And what we're talking about here is this kind of functional life, a quality of life. So when they profile FG and the other person, what was it, Moran? Uh, the second person in the
Manon.
Manon, I'm sorry. And they're kind of profiling, like, look how functional these people are. Like these people are functional and they pass, they blend in. Now, do they have, especially FG, this kind of like still shame about thinking, and not wanting people to know this history and this extreme vulnerability, and it maybe perhaps for Manon too. And Manon is like, I do think about the fact that I can't have kids and so on. A lot of my friends are, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so there's this showing, like, look how functional these kids are, this quality of life. Now, again, these are just two cases. They're not really all that convincing, although they do sound like they're doing, okay, but there's a lot of like, well, that's debatable in terms of what could have been if they had, taken a different treatment path. But again, we're talking about the original Dutch cohort, which is totally the study's totally flawed. It goes from 70 to then 55. Kids are lost to follow-up. They can't continue with hormones because of health complications. They can't continue with surgeries. One kid dies. And also, those surveys were switched. So there's all this confusion about who was saying what about their measuring their gender dysphoria. Was it male saying this about their? And so there's all that confusion. So it's just not reliable. Like that paper, we call it the myth of reliable research, which is that's what we're talking about. So when they're talking with Hillary Cass, and Hillary's Cass is saying, like, thinking about relationships that these kids have, they have jobs, they're able to leave. And Marcy's like so intent on saying, what does that matter? Like, these kids are saying they're happy. They're saying they're happy. They're saying they're doing well. You can see the light come on in their eyes. And to me, that just totally underscored this idea of, and Jamie, you're bursting at the seams here, so
I'm
continue.
bursting. Yes,
Yeah.
I'm bursting because those doctors, okay, imagine you're a doctor like Marcy Bowers, okay, and you have a packed schedule and you're going to see 22 patients that day, okay? First of all,
Yeah.
that tells you nothing about the 30% that you medicalized and they disappeared. They never came back. So from my viewpoint of this whole data set, I'm going, well, where the hell did those 30% go? And also, I knew that it wasn't as some like flowery, like they went off to college. I mean, like I can still see that they're accessing medical care in this region, but they disappeared from us. Okay, so we lost 30%. Then imagine that you are that doctor and you see 22 patients that day, and one of those patients, one, brings you a fruit basket. They make you a little photo montage booklet that shows my before and after and how happy I am. And they gush over how wonderful they feel. In the long run, are you going to, from your clinical memory, remember the one that did that and say, oh, they had that beautiful glint in their eyes? Or are you going to remember that on that day of 22, one did that, 17 were meh, and the other two were suicidal, and you barely talked to them because all you went in and said, are you taking your hormones? Yes. Oh, by the way, go see the social worker, me,
Yeah.
because I'm the endocrinologist and I don't have shit to do with that follow-up care for you. So when I think about what Marcy is saying, the reason why data matters more is because, of course, you're going to remember the patient who brought you the fucking fruit basket and brought you the pictures. And that happened. I know that those kids did that. And when the New York Times finds these 30 families to talk to out of 1,500, and those 30s had glowing things to say, and they do mention in the podcast, they were associated with the parent group that was associated with the clinic. You cannot rely on that as evidence.
There's a Your points are well made, but I want to yes and part of that, Jamie, which is this is Marcy Bowers, whose job it is primarily to remove the healthy genitals of a male and form a facsimile of female genitalia on a boy or a young man. There's so much buildup to the surgery as being the last step in transition, the final item on the checklist to finally and truly becoming a woman. Like this is the ultimate final thing to really break through and becoming your true self. Obviously, Marcy Bowers is going to have excited patients because all of this expectation culminates or climaxes for the last time in his office. And probably there's, I think there's something about like a 30% or 70% complication rate for these surgeries. So I'm sure he sees some of his patients multiple times, but the expectation, I'm done, there's just a little bit more, just a little bit more, just a little bit more. The euphoria hasn't worn off yet. So Marcy Bowers is seeing people at like the happiest days of their lives because they don't know what they're getting into.
Hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead.
There's just this other element of the framing of all of this as the Laura Edwards Leaper versus the Joanne Olson Kennedy approach. We tried to hash that out in our center. I had those, debates with the clinicians. And one of the issues is that I was told that we can't go back to the Laura Edwards Leaper approach because the patient is not going to accept being told no. They're just going to go to the Joanne Elson Kennedy down the road. They're not going to go along with the no. So I have no idea how Laura actually believes that this is functional. If it's like, I don't know of a good analogy, but it's just like Anna Lou told people no. Laura Edwards Leaper told people no. It sounds like Scott Leibowitz also was telling people no without actually telling them no. We didn't tell anyone no because the idea was that A, if we told them no, they're going to go get it elsewhere. We actually had a conversation about it being harm reduction,
Yeah.
that instead of them getting it elsewhere, we might as well just get it from us here. I just don't know how you ever roll back. I also don't trust any of these clinicians to do that. And I'm not saying that I think the Laura Edwards Leaper position is the right one. I'm just saying also in practical purposes, she makes there's no recommendation on how that actually happens.
Yeah. So something that you talk about in the podcast that I believe that your view has changed is at the time you said, I think we're hurting 15 kids to find that one kid who will benefit. And now you see that differently. Is that something that you can talk about?
Yeah, because the one kid, that has that lifelong early onset, that true kind of gender nonconformity
Yeah.
is a proto-gay kid.
Yeah.
They're most likely, if left alone medically, but supported therapeutically, will grow up to be gay.
And why is it that there are obviously some of us that do grow up to be gay and that never cross this threshold or think about, you know, being well, we maybe have gender dysphoria or what could be classified as gender dysphoria, but how do we make it to adulthood and they don't? Or how do some gay people still make it to adulthood and still want to transition, whereas others don't? Like, what's the difference there then? Like, what's the difference between me and you and others who, let's say their gender dysphoria persists through puberty? Let's say they continue to experience discomfort with moving throughout the world as the sex that they are, and not being able to, let's say, pass as the opposite sex or attempting to pass as the opposite sex. What's the difference there? What do you think?
Well, uh, so I don't agree with the concept that puberty is the solution. Just going through puberty, if you're inherently gender dysphoric, is not necessarily the solution. I actually felt like puberty was the hardest period of time for me and would have absolutely met that criteria of gender dysphoria, early childhood, tomboy, worsened at puberty. I don't agree with this myth that puberty fixes it. But did it get better as I got older and older and older? Yes, because you mature and you begin to understand much more about the complexities. But the thing that I always just go back to is I still think that the Dutch had a pathway. They were given a pathway. FG presents, and the two paths are we change FG's body to conform, or we do the actual hard work of working with FG's parents to understand
Mhm.
what gender nonconformity looks like and homosexuality. We work with the school. We work with the peer group. Maybe we work with the gym teacher and say, maybe your gym
Yeah.
class only needs to be sex segregated if you're playing dodgeball and you're going to knock somebody's head off. Maybe we work with the things around FG to say, your gender nonconformity can be embraced as a whole part of society and accepted. Maybe we do the harder work with society instead of just change your body and make you bear all of that. And they chose what
Yeah.
I think they chose the wrong path. They changed
Yeah.
our body.
Well, and the huge
Yeah. And
consequence of that is that, you're choosing not to have a kid remain rooted in reality, in the reality of the material reality of their sex. It's suggesting that sex can be malleable, or that the body can be, changed to match that feeling, which, you know, these interventions and these protocols are can aid someone to pass more appropriately and properly, but a lot of them have huge consequences, so many complications. A lot of them are very unsuccessful, and so a lot of these folks continue to be those imposters that are wearing that mask. And even if they pass, there's that fear of people knowing. There's the shame of knowing all of those things.
yeah.
So they talk about wanting these kids to be able to disappear into society. They wanted them to just disappear and to fit in, to medically engineer them to pass as what they should have been.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
But don't you, I mean, Ben and Corey, as like gay people, don't I mean, isn't there also that element of, I think about the other tomboy that was in FG's life at the time, and what did we say to that person
Hmm.
by FG doing this? What did we say to the kids around FG? We didn't teach them true tolerance. We didn't teach FG resilience. We didn't teach the other tomboy that you're perfect just the way you are. We
Hmm.
didn't teach that teacher to to be more open to gender nonconformity. Instead, we just reinforced this. I mean, I just think that those were the moments where, I wish we could just go back in time.
Hmm.
Just imagine where we would be now if that was the response of the Dutch. The Dutch, if they would have said to those adult transsexuals, I'm really sorry this has not worked out for you. But maybe we need to rethink this entire concept of trans because the data is not showing, even to those adults, this is working.
I guess we're going to wrap up here in a
And
minute.
Yeah.
well, yeah, in a minute. And rather than throw out their precious theory that you can alter the body to placate the mind, they expanded to kids and said, if we start earlier, it'll work. And I guess we're living that out. I think maybe just before we wrap up, Jamie, I only listened to the whistleblower episode once, so I apologize if this was covered and I just forgot. Can you say what happened to your gender center?
Yeah, it closed. So the law,
Yeah,
the injunction, that hearing that I testified in, it was the first time in the country that an injunction that the ACLU did not win. They actually lost right then and there, and the law was allowed to go into effect. There was a grandfather clause in it, but they also extended the statute of limitations for people that were harmed. And guess what all of those hospitals decided to do? They closed because they knew that
yeah,
continuing, even with the clause that they were given, that they were going to harm people in the long run, and they didn't want the risk. They didn't want to pay for it in the long
yeah,
run. So they all closed all across the state. And then there was a full
yeah,
trial, a full 2-week trial, and all of the affidavit and evidence was put on. And the judge wrote in the end of that he believed me to be credible and most of the evidence to support that we were harming kids. And he upheld the SAFE Act, and it is in effect in Missouri.
yeah. But just to be clear, that clinic could still be practicing with patients that were already on a medical pathway if they had faith that they weren't harming the patients in the long term. They made a choice.
They made a choice. Yes. And you're absolutely right, Sarah. They closed.
Yeah. Yeah.
We could probably all talk about this forever and ever, right? There's so much more that we can say, but this was good. I think it was, it was a good, I'm glad that, because there was a lot that I learned, Jamie, about your response to things that I didn't understand or know. And I hope that listeners got a good response to that as well. And I hope that people will leave comments if they want to learn more, or I'll put show notes in. Jamie, can we find your affidavit printed online?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'll put the links to the affidavit and in your free press piece and so on. But also, please reach out to us if you have additional questions about this topic, because we certainly are willing to engage 100%.
And I have a longer Substack on bicalutamide as a drug too. So yeah.
I'll put that in there as well.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you for the
We
time.
expect to be talking about the podcast still next week unless the Scrimeti decision comes down. And so we will see you at the end of the week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.